Welcome back, everyone. I'm Julian Luthol, the founder and CEO of GetGlobal, and we have with us today two phenomenal leaders who are doing some interesting things that are headline issues at the moment, so it's an interesting time to catch their views. So we have Vivek Lal, who is the VP of Strategy at Lockheed Martin, and we have Edward Burton, who is the CEO of the US Saudi Arabian Business Council. Unfortunately, we couldn't have Nisha Biswal with us today. She had to get back to Washington. She was originally in there for as the president of the US India Business Council. But, so yeah, it's an interesting time for the world. We've been hearing in the earlier sessions that the mood with governments around the world has taken on new color and needing new skills. There's a new leader in Brazil, Bolsonaro. AMLO in Mexico definitely wants to run the country his way. You've got a sort of a new tone in the way that government is being requested to respond to the needs of its people, and the leaders that those people are choosing is taking on interesting themes as well. So part of this session is to unpack: is anything significant changing? How should we be communicating not only with governments but with people too? And how do we understand who to talk to, manage crises, whatever, right? Like, how do we really understand this country and how to talk in a bicultural kind of way? So to kick us off, Vivek has some really interesting methods that he's communicated to us before. It was in our speakers dinner last year, but it's a pretty handy methodology for thinking through who to talk to, what kind of relationships to build. And Vivek, why don't you tell us a little bit about it and how you use it?
Sure. Thank you, Julian. So some of the methods, and I found this around the world, but especially in the Indian context, there are various groups of stakeholders when you're dealing with such a large democracy, where there's so many different parts to it, so many states, so many cultures within the culture, so to speak, subcultures, so many different languages. So communications becomes quite an issue in terms of even identifying who are the stakeholders that one wants to talk to advance a certain thought process or a business or a policy, etc. So some of the buckets that I've formed over the last few decades of working in India is, first would be the political spectrum. The political spectrum would entail not just the people that are in power, but also the people that are sitting in the opposition. In India, there's not just two-party system, there are multiple parties, there are regional parties. So if you're trying to seed a thought or seed an opinion of what would be in India's benefit, you really need to reach across all those political parties and create consensus. The other bucket, so to speak, of stakeholders would be the bureaucrats. The bureaucracy is very strong in India, just like it is in the United States. And there are many ministries and agencies that get involved in any particular issue. And so to build those relationships are important, and keeping them live, simply because the bureaucrats keep getting rotated out every couple of years. So that's an important aspect of engagement. The third, I would say, is academia. Many people ignore that. Think tanks, professors, academicians, they are really sometimes the org charts behind the org charts, and they are able to influence, again, a large number of folks in the government. The fourth would be the industry captains. So as India is developing, for example, its industrial base, they look forward to seeing what's of benefit to India, especially when a foreign company is entering. And so making sure to see that whatever you're trying to do in country is a win-win situation is important for the Indian industry captains too. And then finally is the media, and the media communications is so critical. And in India, as I mentioned, there are many languages, many cultures. It's not all in English. So you have to take care of regional issues. Now, although there's this big digital push around the world where more and more people are on smartphones, etc., in India there's still a huge number of people that are actually reading newspapers, etc. So you have to be able to make sure you have a broad brush approach to communications to get to the stakeholders you want. So these are some of the buckets I think that are important.
In the Saudi Arabian context, are there any additional stakeholders that matter that you need to be constantly, maintaining relationships with that could, help or hinder what you're up to as a company in the kingdom?
Sure, but just with a caveat, the more I do this international business thing, the more I realize over the last 13 years my career has been spent closely associated with Saudi Arabia. But before that, other than a very brief and regrettable career practicing law, most of my career has been spent in helping companies do business internationally. And so, actually, besides the Gulf region, over the last 13 years, I spent probably the bulk of my professional career in helping companies in Latin America. So as you indicated, I still try to follow developments there as well. But there, as Vivek said, there are certain stakeholders that are important, no matter what country you happen to have a presence in. And of course, government is one of them. In Saudi Arabia, it happens to be for business. It happens to be several ministries such as finance and commerce. But the political parties and that kind of activity, companies normally don't spend a lot of time on. It's very commercial oriented, Saudi Arabia, in terms of what companies have to do. I would also say, in terms of stakeholders, your level of engagement and where you focus your efforts on inside the kingdom, in terms of getting stakeholder input, depends on the size of the company that you have. I mean, you have many Fortune 500 American companies that have done business in Saudi Arabia since the early 1930s and have billions of dollars in assets on the ground inside Saudi Arabia, and have cultivated them and have nurtured them through a lot of crises, not just the recent one in the newspapers these days. But if you're a startup, and you have a number of American startups in Saudi Arabia, creating joint ventures with small, medium-sized, and large companies, it's going to be a little different approach if you're a startup or a small and medium-sized enterprise. But if you have assets on the ground and you have a large enough presence where you have executives coming in and out of the kingdom all the time, then you spend a lot more time with government. You spend a lot more time with captains of industry, not just those with whom you have strategic relationships, but others taking the pulse of what's going on in the country. So I would say materiality and impact are the primary focus targets of what American companies do there, making sure that what you're doing for stakeholders matters, has material impact to what they're doing.
Yeah, one of the things that I've noticed about India, so I'm an India specialist, lived there a little while, go back often, and got to know enough about the place that there are just certain things that really do not work in India, right? So if you're a company that has, by reputation, controlled some large portion of human life in a country, right? Like the connections between people, the way that Facebook operates, or labor, the way that Walmart has done in certain cities and towns. The immediate trigger that is just waiting to get pulled is memories of the British East India Company, right? So any sense of colonialism, it all started with a corporation, right? The sensitivity is real, right? And you see it over and over again. My question is, and we'll get into that in a second, but back on Saudi Arabia with you, are there similar cultural triggers in the kingdom? And in some of the other places that you've worked, that you've just noticed that an American might not even think that way. We don't, it doesn't occur to us, but if you pull that trigger, it's going to be dangerous.
Yeah, so, Saudi Arabia has the distinction in the Gulf of being the only country in that region that was not subjugated by colonial powers. And it's very proud of that fact. And you see that in many ways culturally, where you don't have the regimentation of the bureaucracy that you get when you have a colonial power run the country basically for decades. But in Saudi Arabia, as in my experiences in Latin America and other countries around the world, business is very much a contact sport. You have to be front and center in the kingdom to do business. And that gets back to the strategies that a small and medium-sized enterprise would have in engaging the kingdom. Those companies that don't have the resources to jump on a plane every quarter and press the flash and make sure that you're in front of your stakeholders, whether they be government or partners or prospective commercial partners. And so that's one of the areas that we constantly tell our companies, our members, you have to have some level of engagement so that you stay on companies' radar screens, because Saudi businesses have a lot of suitors coming from all over the world into that economy, and it's very difficult not to have sustained impact in the market commercially if you're not engaged with them. And so that is sort of a bugaboo that Saudis have, and they'll come to us and say, well, you introduce us to this company, and we don't hear from them, and they don't answer emails. Well, funny enough, that's what American companies say about Saudi. So, they want the engagement, but sometimes communications, being what they are, communication flows, it's somewhat difficult.
One thing that immediately stands out to people's thinking when they, are thinking about Saudi Arabia is, of course, the way that the religious structure or the religious dynamics play into social life, right? And even political life. How do wise American companies, smart American companies, interact with that in ways that are productive and helpful, right?
Well, it's good to know the culture. So I arrived for diplomatic service in Riyadh in 2003. I spent 3 years there, and at that time, not only in Saudi Arabia but all over the world, there was a lot of terrorist activity. Actually, I spent my 3 years there during some of the worst terrorist activity in Saudi Arabia, and so that is a very difficult environment within which to operate. And American companies that had executives there in the kingdom at that time pulled them out. They put them in Manama next door in Bahrain, or Doha in Qatar, or sent them to the United Arab Emirates, and the families actually all left. So it was a very difficult time. Having said that, Saudi society has changed so dramatically since I served there, and leaving in 2006. If you were to tell me back then, in 10 years' time or so, you'll see women driving and movie theaters in Saudi Arabia, I would have said somehow alcohol got into Saudi Arabia, which is unlikely, at least in bars. But so I think when you look at the changes that have occurred in Saudi Arabia, they still have businesses still close up during prayer time, and I remember being there in 2003, 2004, being caught inside a supermarket with the lights going off and the doors closed and you can't get out. Well, that lasts until prayer time is over. So those cultural things and the women, how they dress with the abayas then completely covered just about, and you didn't see some of the dress that you see now. You have movie theaters there. The first American film shown there was Black Panther. All of these things are happening. I just think if you're an American company and you're going into a country like Saudi Arabia, you have to be aware culturally of how to navigate a vastly and rapidly changing situation, which could affect how, your access and how you do business.
So switching now to India on that note, I mean, there's been a lot of change in India, right? I think a lot of things that people who haven't been paying attention to India, the things that they think that they should be sensitive about are probably very different. The way that women are taking center stage in the country right now and demanding change, the way that their influence is being felt as consumers and leaders and employees and political figures. I guess panning out from what I was asking a moment ago, and I'm just a visitor. You're authentic. What are the things that you're always mindful of in India to, especially representing an American company, to not get too close to, or things that just India could take it one way or another, and you just don't want to. You want to take it the good way.
That's an excellent question, Julian. I think for Lockheed Martin, for example, we've been in India for 25 years. And in the journey of Lockheed Martin in India, one thing we've figured out is that you have to be part of the fabric of India. And what I mean by saying that is you have to be local. So you have to have on-the-ground presence. You have to show that you're part of the industrial ecosystem. Just earlier this year, we announced that we will be making the wings of all fighter F-16s in India. So every F-16 that's going to fly around the world that anyone buys is going to have its wings made in India. This is a very significant decision for Lockheed Martin to do that, and it talks to several things. It talks to the fact that in the global supply chain, we think India was the best suited for doing this. And it therefore shows that India's come up on infrastructure, it's come up on technical expertise, it's come up on the various value systems that an American company would want to see in manufacturing such a critical component of a fighter aircraft. It also talks to the fact that we therefore become part of the economy of India, the fabric of India. We have 1,000 people working in India, in Hyderabad, in 2 joint ventures that we have with the Tata Group, for example, that are producing C-130, which is a transport aircraft, empennage. So all C-130s around the world that are flying have their empennage built from India. Also for the Sikorsky helicopters, the cabins are being built in India. This all goes to show that what may not have been possible 10, 20 years ago, now is possible just based on its strategic business case, and also to be able to navigate through the Indian, so to speak, fabric, to be able to call yourself local. And so that's very important in India, that you're actually not there just to sell item A, B, or C and then, parachute out. But you're there for the long term, you're there for win-win. India is very rich with resources, human resources. The average age is in their 20s over there. So a lot of technical skill over there. And I think American companies have realized that one can leverage all that for the benefit, not just for India, but for the United States as well.
And it seems to go in a lot of different directions and hits a bunch of targets at the same time, right? The Make in India program, it shows that Lockheed cares what the Prime Minister is trying to do for the country. Obviously, work is huge issue with young people and skills and training. So how do you work with the media to get the story out and in the way that you want?
Right, and that again is a good question. There are various elements to a media strategy, if you will, so that you are able to get the message out there and especially the intent of doing the various activities. Other than the mainline media, whether it's the newspapers or the wires, engaging at the regional level with the regional languages is important because, as you know, there's 500 plus parliamentarians over there representing different regions of India, and not all the regions will be English speaking. And so as an American company, you go in there and you think you put a press release out there hoping that everyone kind of gets it. That usually doesn't work because that's just talking to only a segment of society.
So I'm going to take a quick poll here. Out of all the newspapers in India, how many English-speaking newspapers do you think are in the top 10 in terms of readership?
2.
2?
World?
Another number up there?
The top Indian papers in the world, are you talking about?
Yeah, well, within India, but that's where the biggest ones would be. So out of the top 10 by readership, how many of them are English language? 2. I'm hearing 2 a lot. 0. 0. Exactly 0. So if you're not speaking in the local languages, there is a story that's going on about you that you are just not hearing. It's true. No, it's how do you advise working with the media inside of Saudi Arabia? I'm imagining it's a loud, boisterous environment in India with the media. It's 24 hours. It's like cable news all the time here, and lots of masala, as they say. What do you think about Saudi Arabia?
Well, as a council, we have our hands full just on our own trying to manage the media, and actually with all that's going on and has gone on between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia over the years. We as a business council hired our own public relations firm because, as you say, if you don't get the public relations right, if you don't get the messaging right, someone else is going to tell your story. We learned that very early on. So, whether it's the fallout from 9/11 or the JASTA bill, the Justice Against Sponsored Terrorism Act that was enacted a couple of years ago, which allowed private citizens to sue the kingdom as a result of what happened on 9/11, and the Jamal Khashoggi case. I mean, those are all issues that have come up that have the potential of seriously impacting business, the business that our companies do with each other. So as a business council, actually, I don't want to deliver my remarks, I'm giving it another hour, but I will mention, I have, of course, as the CEO of the U.S. Saudi Business Council, received many requests for interviews and commentary on the Khashoggi killing, and this is actually the first public, these are actually the first public statements that I'll be making. And there's several reasons for that, which I'll explain in about an hour. But getting that right, because we, for many of our member companies, the voice that's out there most and consistently will not be the individual companies unless they're directly impacted or they take action, which makes the headlines. It's the business council for those members that are a part of what we do. And so we have to be very careful in that messaging and what we say. And so our public relations firm is one of the best in Washington, and they help us navigate things and make sure we don't say the wrong things and say all the right things. But companies normally, like a Lockheed Martin, I have to give a plug for your CEO, who I met last year when President Trump visited, made his first inaugural trip overseas to Riyadh. She's just fantastic. She's probably your best public relations person out there. And having Lockheed Martin as a member of the Business Council, we not only give advice when asked, but we also take advice from watching companies like Lockheed Martin navigate in a market like Saudi Arabia and what they do. Of course, they have the budget for PR and messaging, but they do it very well.
So panning out in both cases to say that, you've mentioned culture, we've talked about culture. How do you get a sense of where a country is culturally if you're just getting to know the place? If you're familiar with one, maybe it's easy to think that those ideas that you've developed are portable to that country, but if there's anything we know about, collective memory as a culture, each one is specific to itself, right? What are your tips?
So in the Indian context, I think getting strong local partners is helpful and is important in the journey. And I guess it's going to be shared destiny into the future. You cannot just come in and sell equipment and leave, and then come back in and sell more equipment. The nature of the relationship has moved on from a buy-sell relationship, and therefore you have to partner. And the local partners who've lived there, grown up there, grown their companies up there, they know best of what are the landmines to avoid in terms of whether it is media, whether it is industrial engagement at the state levels or at the center level. And so, of course, getting the right partners up front is very important, therefore. And that vetting process, I think, is very important. But once you do have them as true partners, whether in a JV arrangement or whether in a teaming agreement arrangement, it's shared destiny from there on. And so that seems to work really well for the companies that I've seen in at least the aerospace and defense space there.
And what are your thoughts?
Well, of course, we're a membership organization, the U.S. Saudi Business Council. In the Saudi context, the way we operate our business council is very much how we view the importance of stakeholders, our members, and others that impact our organization. So, from a functionality perspective, our business council makes it a practice of contacting each of the approximately 250 members that we have, equally divided between U.S. and Saudi companies, on a quarterly basis, and making sure that contact has frequency and has significance to the company. We also have a fee-for-service program in our business council where you don't have to be a member of our business council to tap into our services, our programs, the connections that we have in Saudi Arabia. And so we make it a habit of making sure that we contact those companies on a periodic basis. Again, to put our fingers on the pulse to make sure that their market strategies are going well, or try to troubleshoot any difficulties they're having in the market. And so I think making sure that, again, you're constantly in the face of these folks, not in an annoying way, but making sure that your contact really has relevance to their market activity is very important.
I'd just like to add the U.S. embassies are also extremely helpful in that process. So the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service that usually is housed within the U.S. Embassy in Delhi or any other capital, they play an instrumental role in helping and guiding U.S. companies and being a constant counsel as one goes on that journey. And so they have been a tremendous asset, and they're all often not talked about, but they, again, provide critical guidance.
I have to echo that because I've served as commercial attaché for the 3 years that I was in Saudi Arabia as a member of the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service. And the folks there in Riyadh and the two consulates in Jeddah and Dhahran just do stellar work day in and day out in serving the interests of American companies, as they do in embassies and consulates around the world. So it's a great resource that doesn't cost a lot of money. It's taxpayer money, actually, that a lot of people don't know about. It's amazing. A lot of small, medium-sized companies don't know about it. The big companies know about it, and they use those services. So yes.
I wish people knew how much is out there that the government can do for them. So it took us until very late in our first year to partner with the commercial service, and getting to know them and what they do and what companies think about them and whether they're big, small, whatever. I'm amazed, because on the one hand, you've got people who, they're public servants, right? They don't have anything. They're not going to get a commission. They're not doing anything like that, and they care a lot. And I don't think I've ever met a jerk from Department of Commerce. Like, somehow they've all been like really, really nice people. So I don't know if we've got them here today. I think we've got one, but if you do meet some folks from Commerce, make buddies.
Can I usurp your authority and
Sure,
ask,
sure.
those of you out in the audience that have a business and run international markets, have you raised your hand if you've heard about or utilized the services of the U.S. Commercial Service? Oh, okay, that's enough.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. So, managing crises. So what happens when it all goes wrong, right? How do you perform triage on the situation? How do you know when you're in the clear? What are some examples, like maybe not going on right now, but in the past where we've managed to get over things and the key learnings of developing a really good communications and government affairs strategy when things get tough?
Okay, so specific examples, I think what we just talked about, putting some of the building blocks in place to handle an emergent situation where there's a crisis is important. So as he mentioned, PR firms and engaging the best in the communications field is, you may not think of it until one does some business, but I think it's important to load that up front as part of the initiation to going into a new market. And there are certain things to safeguard yourself from, because they're competitors from other countries in the market, and there are oftentimes competitors who would not want to see you succeed in the country, and so they'll throw roadblocks out there. So it's important to arm oneself ahead of time so that one can protect oneself from getting in trouble when there's situations like that, especially in the media, when there can be stories that are planted or false allegations or things of that nature. So it's important to always have the systems in place and the processes so that one is not reacting but is proactive to take care of those situations.
So you're saying by the time the crisis is going on, it's just too late. You really got to know people and think about it ahead. What do you think?
So with us, knock on wood, we've not, as a business council, had any adverse public scrutiny paid to us for anything that we've done. But of course, our members have, and from the lessons learned from those companies, in my own notebook, I always see best practices in terms of public relations as having really common themes, and one of them is honesty immediately. Another is consistency in messaging all the time, and the other is trust your public. And what I've come to know companies when they say trust your public, it's basically all the stakeholders that have an impact in how sustainable your company is, your products and services, the marketability of them in any market around the world, and that can be very tough. And I think that's one of the major reasons why companies hire public relations firms in most of the markets that they deal with, because culturally, from a business perspective, from society, we're all different. We're a global village, but messaging in a particular country would not work well in another. And you can use Google's example a few years ago in penetrating the Chinese market and falling under the sword of Chinese regulations having to do with censorship. And one of the mottos or missions of Google is do no harm and really full disclosure. And so they went against their own practices and mission by being subservient to the Chinese government. So they've had their difficulties. But the press and the story about that reverberated globally and really had a negative impact on Google's reputation. So, I think making sure that coming right out of the gates you're as honest as possible with the public and you're consistent with your messaging is something that I've seen companies, members and non-members of the Business Council do very well.
Just to add to that, I want to say that the business councils and the chambers of commerce have an instrumental role in all of this, because they're such a reservoir information and background in different sectors. There's a lot for a new entrant to learn from and to get engaged in that ecosystem, because more knowledge will only make you stronger to handle a new market entry.
Actually, that's a good point. Our business council has found on a number of issues that have come up with impact to our companies, that our companies have a voice and they're saying one thing to us, which they won't say to any government official as a result of some official public policy that's come down or regulation that's impacting an entire industry. And so although they're reticent in speaking out directly to government or voicing opinion in the public, many have come to us on specific issues and expect us as a business council to be their voice without naming any company names, to be their voice in articulating their positions as an industry.
So the flip side of all of this is building trust. I guess in a crisis, you should have already built that trust, and that comes with developing relationships, showing face, going out there and participating in things oftentimes that have nothing to do with business, right? I think especially in weaker enforcement, law enforcement and regulatory environments, where folks rely a lot more on relationships than on laws. That's probably really important. But what are the things that you've seen that are just surefire, awesome ways to build trust in not only the markets that you focus on most, but in other places too?
So I think integrity and honesty, they touched on, is not only mandatory, but it's also a discriminator for U.S. companies. In a lot of these markets, I think one of the critical ways to build trust is the fact that you come in to do business with a lot of integrity, honesty, which may or may not have been that government's experience with other countries or other companies. And so that's an inherent positive discriminator. To build trust, again, is to understand and be active listeners and understand where is the government or the entity that you're doing business with. What are their pain points and how are you addressing it? And if they see you leaning forward to address their issues, I think it builds a lot of trust and rapport. But as you said, these relationships take time to build, and so this does not happen overnight, and one has to be persistent and consistent. If there is a lucrative contract to go after, if you're engaging just when you learn about this lucrative contract, it's already too late. There have been people there that have been nurturing it for years. So immediate gratification in business is seldom a good strategy in some of these economies.
So then it takes some hardcore networking and keeping up with people and maintaining relationships and stuff like that. So building GetGlobal gives me a great reason to go networking. But I'm curious about how, we'll start with you, Ed. How did you develop your network where you were able to do this? I mean, it probably helped that you came from the embassy in Riyadh. But what did you do next? How did you build that reservoir of trust for yourself?
So I've been fortunate in my career where I've gone into professional situations and roles where I've had people help me. Before arriving to diplomatic service in Riyadh at the embassy, I worked, as I said, most of my career helping companies. So I got to know what companies expect from people that put their hand out in support. But also, trust goes both ways. Not to get off of that subject, but trust goes both ways. And so when I went to Riyadh, there are a number of Foreign Service nationals. I don't think they call them that anymore, but these are local people that the embassy and consulates hire to help them do their work. And the commercial service does this worldwide. And so I had a few colleagues there that had been there decades that actually took me under their wing and introduced me to just about every business person in Saudi Arabia, particularly Riyadh. Those formed the basis, of course, touch points to leverage for many, many other relationships that I was able to have, and then leave foreign service and then carry that over into my business council work. And so many, most of the major business people in Saudi Arabia I know or know me. I mean, that seed, that grain happened when I first landed in Saudi and had people help me make those introductions. So I would say one of the strategically critical aspects of networking is making sure that networking is not just a one-off, that you learn how to strategically leverage one person to the next group, or to the next person. And that's what I was able to do, and it's still paying dividends as I enter my 13th year at the council.
I gotta know how you do it in India. Somehow, like, you make magic happen. What's your secret?
It's kind of you to say. So there's no shortcuts. I think, as he said, you build some trusting relationships, and you continue to cultivate them. It's just a way of life on an everyday basis to network. And I think in India especially, it's a very important aspect of doing business is that you continue to network, not only with the folks that you think you'll need to deal with, but the folks that may have nothing to do with the situation or the sector you're in, because more often than not, if you're just networking with, let's say, the aerospace and defense folks, you'll eventually get to know all of the people in that space. But to be truly effective, and you have to know people that may have nothing to do with aerospace. And for example, the people that have influence over the finance or the economics of the country, those are equally important. You may have these great visions of doing various things, but if there's no money to back that up, it doesn't really lead to the end result you want. So you have to network with the commerce folks, the finance folks, just a cross section, but it all starts with a few trusting relationships that then hold your hand and move forward the network.
Your WhatsApp must be intense, I'm sure. So thank you for keeping in touch with me. Get a message on Christmas or something, or Diwali. That's meant a lot to me. So can we take some questions? What do you guys think?
Sure.
Okay. Anyone want to know something in particular about our topic for the day? Anyone? You guys know this stuff already? Come on.
I'm just assuming that you are of African descent or African-American descent? And
African American, 100%.
Okay. Did you find that there were any additional challenges because of your ethnicity in that particular market?
That's an interesting
Can you
question.
repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. For those who didn't hear that, she was questioning me on my ethnicity, and of course I'm African American, both sides, and whether that had any impact in serving diplomatically in Saudi. First of all, I gotta say, a diplomat's life is really nice. The amount of deference that you're paid as a diplomat working overseas is great. I miss it. I miss the black passport and all that. But it's funny you should mention that, because I tell this story sometimes to friends. When I first arrived in Saudi Arabia in 2003, it was in August. And I don't know whether any of you have been in the Gulf region in the summer months, but it gets extremely hot. And so the moment I got off of the plane, from the moment that I got to my quarters for the first time, I must have had maybe 15 people come up to me and engage me in conversation in Arabic, assuming that I was Arabic descent from some country, somewhere, either in Sudan or somewhere. So that's probably one of the most interesting aspects of serving as an African American in Saudi Arabia, because there are many people that look like me, and in all sorts of shades. And so I won't say that had any catalyst in exacting some relationships of endearment to people, and I can't say that I had any opportunities to use it as to my advantage. But yes, I mean it was palpable in certain situations where I knew that I was African American, and I knew that I could blend in if I needed to. Because remember, as I said, I served in Saudi Arabia in during some of the worst terrorist activities in Saudi Arabia. So some people were, including me, a little jittery and nervous. So, good question.
There's a lot of cultural exchange between Africa and the Middle East. We did an event in November of last year in Dubai, and it's really interesting to see all the interactions from the region and into Africa, and how often the business people travel to Africa from Dubai. It's pretty cool. Any other questions? Anyone? Laurent?
Putting me on the spot here. Apologies for coming in a little bit late. I was over year one at the other session there. But so if I'm asking a question that's in any way repetitive, I apologize in advance. But I'm curious as to government affairs and a communication standpoint. Is there a challenge sometimes from both of your perspectives when it comes to trying to figure out a way to create a business relationship within a certain environment, whether it's between the United States companies and Saudi Arabian companies, or between US and Indian companies, but where there might be cultural stigmas previously affiliated or attached to the industry or the product, or things that are just very unfamiliar, especially when there are a lot of companies here in the US that are in disruptive industries that are looking at different ways to expand them abroad. For example, the latest craze right now here in the US are scooters, and everyone having electric scooters everywhere and racing them all around. Or for example, one of the gentlemen in the other room from Endeavor, William Morris Endeavor, mentioned how they have a professional bull riding competition network, and then mentioned the idea of exporting that to India. And some of us in the crowd just sort of chuckled and said, I'm not going to wait for that to happen. Certain cultural challenges there. So I'm curious, from your experience, as you try to bring new industries into the countries and your partnerships over there, if you run into sort of those cultural challenges or stigmas affiliated with certain industries where they say that I don't want to go there, even if it will potentially make billions and employ thousands of people.
That's a super interesting question. So to recap for the audio, how do you, when you're taking new and sort of specific businesses and models into new countries, like bull riding or cannabis or scooters or something like that, how do you figure out how to develop the relationships to be able to pull that off? Is that right?
In a nutshell.
Sure. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I'll take this one only because
Are the scooters joining the council yet?
not two wheels,
They
maybe
should.
the four wheels. The perfect example of this would be Uber, and the Saudi Arabian Public or Sovereign Wealth Fund, Public Investment Fund, PIF is what they call it, has been buying up technology here in the United States at a pretty good clip, beginning years before 2016, but it's in 2016 where the investments really started to ramp up to the point where I think it's like $16 billion so far. And Uber, they own 10% of Uber. And so they acquired that stake in Uber prior to June of this year when women began to drive. And I remember the lead up to the purchase of that stake in Uber, everyone was scratching their heads, well, women aren't going to use that. Why would women culturally would not get in a car with, taxi and just ride somewhere. And so there was this clash of technology hitting Saudi Arabia for the first time, and that is when the impetus for women driving really picked up. And so, yeah, it was a sort of an anathema of Saudi culture to have Ubers. Anyone can do an Uber. Anyone can be an Uber driver. Could a woman be an Uber driver? Or is it just men? So all these cultural clashes were happening at the same time. But again, the PIF, the Public Investment Fund, had no qualms about going after disruptive technologies or services like Uber. And they are really on a tear right now in terms of acquiring technologies. And I think that'll continue.
Yeah, and you know, we're a little bit over time, but I wanted to just ask one little follow-up here. Partnering with PIF, how much muscle does that contribute inside of the country to have a large and very visible investment fund take out a stake in your company and help in the region?
Well, it's a big player. I mean, they have right now about $250 billion in assets under management. That's going to go, depending upon what they do with Saudi Aramco or SABIC sale, that's projected to hit $1 trillion in the next 6 to 7 years. So they are a major player. To have that kind of heft along with other partner players like SoftBank and some other large financial institutions like BlackRock behind you, I mean, that means a lot to a startup or disruptive technology firm. And I think you're seeing that played out continually in Silicon Valley, because despite what's going on now, people are still interested in funding.
We're going to be talking about this a little bit later with another Middle Eastern group that's out here speaking here. But kind of come to Power Capital session. Vivek, any closing thought?
Well, I think thanks for the session, and the only thing I could say is your WhatsApp list is more impressive than
No. But thank you both, really. Ed, thank you for your support.
Thank you.
Really, that meant a lot to us, and really glad you both can be here. Thank you.